law enforcement priority. Joining us to discuss the matter is Mason Tvert, who is the campaign manager behind the effort. He runs SAFER, which stands for the Safer Alternative for Enjoyable Recreation, and Sergeant Ernie Martinez with the Denver Police Department, who is also the president of the Colorado Drug Investigators Association. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Let's jump right in. Lewis Johnson writes in, he'd like to know, and Mason, I'll ask you this question first. What's the big deal, he writes, behind this initiative? No matter what happens in Denver, there's still state and federal laws dealing with marijuana, right? He writes in his words, this won't change anything.
Well, that's actually incorrect. As we've seen, federal law really doesn't matter here in the state because we have a medical marijuana law which is implemented by the state. Our state health department oversees that program, and that's a direct violation of federal law. So they also don't enforce federal law when it comes to possession of small amounts of marijuana by adults. So when it comes to this law, our city is under no obligation to enforce state law. There's a number of state laws our city doesn't enforce. That includes a particular state law regarding DUI. It's currently illegal under state law to commit adultery. It's illegal to cross against a signal, jaywalking. But yet our city has prioritized certain crimes, violent crimes and property damage and so on, and determined that those are more important. And we think that our city should stop wasting its resources arresting adults for marijuana, a drug that's far less harmful than alcohol, and worry more about those violent crimes, and this initiative will do just that.
Sergeant, let me pose to you a question from Larry, and it's actually probably more of a statement than a question. He writes in saying the fact the Denver Police Department and City Attorney's Office are using resources to prosecute marijuana cases at a time when we're being asked to raise our property taxes for other services is, in his words, quote, ridiculous. Why should people... well, please respond to that.
Sure, absolutely. The resources, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Resources from the Denver Police Department usually involve just the citation, a ticket for marijuana possession under state statute. So we're under statutory obligation and duty to enforce those laws. So normally they're a lesser included offense to something far bigger than the marijuana case or that particular marijuana ticket. So we will continue to enforce those statutes as obligated by statutory authority. In addition, that resources used take anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute to write that ticket. And most of the tickets in Denver for marijuana under that state statute obligation are usually litigated outside of courtroom time. And most people pay the fine of $100.
Sergeant, let me ask you in follow-up, because there is this impression out there that and certainly Mr. Tvert will talk about it here, I'm sure, in a minute. But let me read you a quote from Marcia, who writes in saying, why do the people, or the police rather, treat people who use marijuana so harshly? She says it's less harmful than alcohol. Is this a case where the police are treating?
No. We don't treat anybody any different than we uphold the professional standard, number one. If that perception is out there with this particular individual, it's a perception. We enforce a lot of different laws, and Mason mentioned quite a few of them. We do everything we can to make sure that we have our city safe, all right? And that includes city ordinances, state statutes, and federal regulations and laws that we have to enforce. Now, as far as marijuana being safer, how could being under the influence of a mind-altering drug be safer than alcohol? Alcohol, we have 50% of people in the United States that use alcohol, and we see all the effects of the ruined lives, of the accidents, of lost time at work, of medical claims, of alcohol abuse. You see the same thing with marijuana. The thing is, with marijuana, there's a small percentage across the nation that utilize marijuana, so the information out there is skewed. So you've got to take that proportionality into your argument.
Mason, let me set you up, because I know you want to speak to that question. And Michael writes in saying, why do you make the argument that marijuana is better than alcohol when it's clear? And I think he would echo, Michael would, what Sergeant Martinez just said. Neither one, he writes, should be encouraged. You're operating under the premise that one is less harmful than another. But he writes in, if there's harm with either, why promote either?
Well, I certainly don't think either should be encouraged, but what we're suggesting is that marijuana can be an alternative to alcohol for many people. And as we've seen in this state, unfortunately, we've had very serious alcohol problems. 50% of every case of domestic violence in Denver involves alcohol, and it's a predominant factor in every fatal case. We've had multiple college students die from alcohol overdoses. There's never been a marijuana overdose death in history. And with regards to enforcement of this, Sergeant Martinez says that they're not spending any time on this, but I'd just like to point out that the city of Seattle passed a very similar initiative to this back in 2003, and right now the city of Denver, despite having fewer people than Seattle, is arresting 23 times as many adults. And it certainly doesn't make me feel any safer, because currently Seattle has a lower rate of violent crime and a lower rate of homicide. So clearly our resources could be put towards something more important, like worrying about those crimes and putting us on par with those types of cities and having lower rates of violent crime. He says that it's just a ticket, but it's an arrest. It goes on your permanent criminal record. Kids lose college tuition. People lose their jobs. They lose the ability to adopt children, and so on. And I should also point out that every person who's cited for marijuana must go to court. So what he said was disingenuous. You are required by law to go to court for a marijuana citation under all circumstances. So our courts have to deal with this, and they're dealing with 1,400 cases of adults over 21 a year.
Sergeant, Mason brings up an issue that I think I've heard from a lot of the supporters about this, in that, you know, you can choose as a police officer whether you're going to write somebody a ticket for speeding. You can give them a warning, you can give them a ticket. Why would this marijuana use be any different, in your opinion? What is the distinction that makes this a more significant issue than, say, a speeding violation or a jaywalking violation that he brought up earlier?
A lot of you have to go in every type of situation. There's a lot of factors where we have the ability to give a warning or to give the ticket. The bottom line is most marijuana possession cases are, as I stated before, a lesser included offense. But at the same time, because of the mere possession of an illegal drug, a legal substance, the ticket is a necessary enforcement issue. Now, the fact is, mentioning Seattle, what isn't mentioned is Seattle officers are seeing an increase in certain crimes. We had a National Institute of Justice study just a couple of years ago here in Denver, and they tested every single inmate in the Denver County Jail. And almost 40% of all offenders arrested for violent crimes in the city, 35% of those arrested for domestic violence tested positive for marijuana. This is a National Institute of Justice study with scientific methodologies that cannot be disproven. There's a lot of misinformation out there that has a lot of different skewed information that the SAFE organization is trying to push. It is not safer.
Let me ask this question. James Marshall writes in saying, in his words, I know there's no definitive link between marijuana use and other drug use, but people, he writes, and Mason, I'll have you answer this, who use harder drugs seem to use marijuana as well, in his words. Why would we want to loosen restrictions on any drugs?
Well, the fact of the matter is that if you're looking at a correlation, which is what he's talking about, people who happen to use harder drugs happen to have used marijuana. Everyone's used alcohol and tobacco before that they use harder drugs. So if we're talking about a gateway drug, then alcohol would be the biggest gateway drug out there. But I don't think Mr. Martinez wants to ban alcohol, or at least I don't think he does. But the fact remains that he's suggesting that because people have marijuana in their system that somehow contributed to their crime. That was a very disingenuous statement, because marijuana remains in the system for up to 30 days. So if you had a drink 30 days ago and then committed a crime, would it be because of alcohol? Of course not, and that's the case with marijuana. But the studies do show, and the FBI reports, that two-thirds of violent offenders in this country have alcohol in their system. They're actually under the influence of it, and it contributes to their crime. So there's a big difference here. Yes, marijuana is in people's systems. It's because it's widely used and because it remains in your body for so long. But alcohol actually does lead to violence, and it just takes walking down Colfax to understand that. I mean, if you walk down Colfax on a Saturday night, do you worry about someone who might be high on marijuana, or do you worry about a drunk driver, a violent person who might start a fight or mug you? I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and the people of Denver have already recognized this. They voted on it, and, you know, Sergeant Martinez is so concerned about upholding the laws. I think he should uphold the laws of his city, Denver, before he worries about other laws.
Let's wrap this up. John Briargate writes in and asks the question, let's assume this passes, he says. Realistically, what's going to change? Sergeant? Realistically,
we are going to still enforce the Colorado Revised Statutes, and that is marijuana possession under 1414-406. The misinformation on the past ordinance proposal that was passed a couple of years ago by the proposal with SAFER really didn't have the correct information out there. Granted, that was passed and it's a city ordinance change, but at the same time, we're obligated under state statute. We take an oath to uphold laws of the entire governmental entities, city, state, and federal. So we're going to continue to enforce it. We get calls all the time on marijuana sales at Civic Center Park, sales at a street corner. That's what prompts us to actually enact our enforcement actions.
Mason, what happens realistically
Well,
if this passes?
I just want to point out that marijuana sales and driving under the influence and so on are not covered under this law. Those will remain illegal, so marijuana sales in Civic Center Park are of no consequence. But the fact remains that if Mr. Martinez wants to uphold Colorado's law, he will be forced to enforce this law because the state constitution clearly says in Article 20, Section 6, that when there are city ordinances that are clearly in violation of state statutes, the ordinance, quote, shall supersede. So if Sergeant Martinez and the rest of his police department want to uphold the laws of Colorado and the Constitution of Colorado and the Constitution of the United States, they would respect the will of the voters and stop arresting adults for simply using a drug less harmful than alcohol.
Mason Tvert, Sergeant Ernie Martinez.